Our second speaker this morning is Brother Steve McGeorge of the Tea Tree Gully, Adelaide, Australia Ecclesia. The theme for Brother Steve's classes this week is the Levites, They Shall Be Mine. Today's class is entitled Porters and Gatekeepers. Brother Steve.
Well, brothers and sisters, yesterday we considered the Levites as soldiers, and specifically in respect to the battles they would face doing the duties of the tabernacle. And we followed that theme all the way through Scripture. Now we're going to come back to Numbers again and begin a new theme. Because we want to ask the question this morning, would there ever really be a need to pick up a real sword and use it? Well, there is actually another reason given for the Levites to be soldiers as they camped around Yahweh's tabernacle, and it's mentioned for us in Numbers chapter 1. Verse 51. And when the tabernacle setteth forth, the Levites shall take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites shall set it up. And the stranger that cometh nigh shall be put to death. And that comes up again in chapter 3, verse 10, 38, and chapter 18, verse 4 and 7. Any stranger that comes near would be put to death. In chapter 1, verse 53, it says, But the Levites shall pitch round about the tabernacle of the testimony, that there be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel, no anger from God. Come to chapter 8 of Numbers, verse 19. And I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and to his sons from among the children of Israel, to do the service of the children of Israel in the tabernacle of the congregation, and to make an atonement for the children of Israel, that there be no plague among the children of Israel when the children of Israel come nigh to the sanctuary. No plague, no anger, no wrath from God. Chapter 18, verse 22. It says this, Neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh the tabernacle of the congregation, lest they bear their sin and die. So the Levites stopped Yahweh's wrath coming upon the nation through plagues by stopping and, if necessary, killing anyone who came near that were not allowed. And any that came for whatever reason that were not allowed, they could be killed by the Levites. They were the protectors of God's holiness. They guarded the doors, checking all that entered in, and if someone tried to enter in that shouldn't, they had the authority of God to manhandle them away and, if necessary, kill them in order to stop God from sending a plague. So it's a very important work. There's no wimps here. This aspect of the work of the Levites actually develops into a significant role by the time of David. So let's come across and follow this theme of protecting God's holiness by being a gatekeeper by coming to 1 Chronicles and chapter 23. So in 1 Chronicles 23, we read about David organizing the Levites into their various roles. And you can see in verse 3 that David had at his disposal 38,000 Levites from 30 years old and upwards. Now the Levites numbered from the age of 30 years and upward, and their number by the polls was 38,000. And he divides them all up. And in verse 4, he had 24,000 to do all the servile work. And in verse 4, he had 6,000 to be officers and judges. And we'll be looking at that role of the Levites in study 5. But then in verse 5, just note this. In verse 5, 4,000 were porters. That is, a gatekeeper. That's 1,000 per each side of the temple. And in verse 5, we also see that there were 4,000 singers. And these actually were more than just singers. They were there to praise and thank Yahweh and to teach Israel to do the same by putting words into song that taught. They were singing teachers. And then in verse 6 through to verse 23, we find David organizing them into courses or divisions. And in the process, he establishes a structure, a framework by which the Levites become instrumental in maintaining true worship in the nation, beginning first and foremost with God's house. So this is David organizing all of the divisions of the Levites and the priests. So the way that happens is that from chapter 24 through to chapter 26, we get this breakdown of the ordering of the Levites. Chapter 24 is all about the division of the priests. In chapter 25, it's the division of the singers. But come to chapter 26, because this one is the division of the porters and the division of the judges and officers. Verse 1 to 28 is the porters. Verse 29 to 32 is the judges and the officers. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 26, concerning the divisions of the porters. Now, a Bible commentator by the name of Gill's exposition of the whole Bible, he just mentions this about what that would entail. I think it's quite interesting to read. The porters, or he says, the doorkeepers, whose business it was to open and shut the doors of the temple, to keep all impure and improper persons from entering in, and to keep any vessels from being carried out, and to prevent tumults and riots around it. So all those precious things inside the temple were to be protected, not to be stolen. And people that were impure were to be withholden from entering in. That was the role of the porters. Now, I want you to notice who they were in chapter 26. In verse 1 to 9, we find out of the Korahites was Meshelemiah, the son of Korah, of the sons of Asaph. And the number of that group, we find, was 75 persons in verse 1 to 9. So from the family of Korah. In verse 10 and 11, we have Hosah of the children of Merari. Another division of the Levites, the family of Merari. 18. So put that together, you have 93 who are the leaders of all the porters. Notice where the greater number comes from. Comes from the line of Korah. Now that's not insignificant, brothers and sisters. These sons of Korah, you remember, did not stand with their father Korah when he defiantly stood in the door of his own tent. Now you just picture that scene. Go back in your mind to that scene in number 16. Because there was Dathan, okay, and he stood in the door of his own tent, defiant, arrogant, and with him was all his children. And there was Abiram sitting in the door of his tent, arms crossed, defiant, arrogant, and with him all his children. And there was Korah standing in the door of his own tent, defiant, arrogant, and alone. You've never seen anything like it, brothers and sisters. And the sons of Korah made a bold, clear statement on that day that they would maintain faithfulness, that they would remain faithful to Yahweh's house, to Yahweh's tent, whatever the cost, even if it meant losing Dad. So here they are, years later, in the time of David, still faithfully protecting Yahweh's house. Now, one of them is named Obed-Edom in verse 4. This is the same Obed-Edom that's recorded as taking care of the ark, you remember. The ark went into the house of Obed-Edom We're introduced to him in 1 Chronicles chapter 13. Remember, after the tragedy of Uzzah, he went into his house for 3 months. Why? Well, in 1 Chronicles 15 and verse 18, he's called a porter. In fact, in verse 24, he's called a doorkeeper for the ark. So this isn't just a role as a doorkeeper looking after doors. The doorkeepers were also to stop anyone from looking inside the ark. And so they had 2 in front of the ark, and they had 2 behind the ark. Why would you need doorkeepers on the ark? Well, you remember something happened some years ago where people did look inside the ark and 50,000 died. There was no one being a doorkeeper for the ark on that occasion. It had happened before. And so these doorkeepers had a very important role. And on that occasion back then, they were smitten with that plague because no one was protecting Yahweh's holiness. Well, now there's 4 of them, and one of them was called Obed-Edom. And God, of course, blessed him greatly for his faithfulness and his role as a doorkeeper. And how did God bless him? Well, if you come into 1 Chronicles 26 here and verse 4 and 5, God blessed him in verse 5. Amiel the 6th, Issachar the 7th, Pilthai the 8th, for God blessed him. How did God bless him? Well, by giving him more gatekeepers in the family. 8 sons in all. And of course, they went on to have sons too. All of the family of Obed-Edom, we're told in verse 8, was 62. But I want you to look at the qualities of these gatekeepers. We said there are no wimps here. Look at the language. Verse 6, they're called mighty men of valor. Verse 7, they're called strong men. Verse 8, they're called able men for strength. Verse 9, strong men. You didn't mess with these fellas. They were strong, not just physically, brothers and sisters, which is obviously something they had to be able to manhandle people, and we'll see a case of this later on, but they also had to have strength of character. Strength of character by which they remained true to their God. They were following their forefathers, weren't they? The sons of Korah, the first in the line of the sons of Korah, who were noted for being dependable when things were crashing down around them. They were strong in the face of immense pressure, and it was enormous pressure that they would have had from their dad to stand aside. And they resisted it because they were strong back then, and they're still strong here. And they wouldn't be moved even when Dad set up an alternate tabernacle, as we know he did. And God said, that's the sort of people I need to guard my tabernacle, guard its doors, guard its furniture, protect my holiness, and in so doing, protect the ecclesia. People that don't wilt under the hot sun of trials, but soldier on. Now, David took these men and made them the chief over all the porters. So as we said, there were 93 chief men, and they were responsible for all the gates. And they had at their disposal 4,000 of the Levites to assist them. So verse 13 to 19 shows the division of all the gates. And of course, David introduced lots of gates. He wanted access for everyone to come to the temple. So I'll just put it on a slide here. You'll see. Then in verse 4, we have a description of the east gate. And the east gate, we're told in verse 17, which is the main gate, had 6 guards on the main gate. In verse 14, we're told about the north gate. The north gate, headed up by Zechariah, Meshelemiah's son. It went on to be later called the Teri gate. They had 4 guards on that gate. On the south gate, in verse 15, was Obed-Edom. This particular gate had 4 guards, But then it also had 4 guards, 2 at the front, 2 at the back, at a place called the House of a Suppum. The word "suppum" means the gatherings or the collections. So when they brought the tithes and all those things that came up, they were stored in the treasure house. Well, you'd want guards on that, wouldn't you? No good protecting just the temple, and there's the treasure house open for anyone to steal. This needed guarding and protecting too. And then we have finally on the west gate, in verse 16, Hosah, 4 guards at the gate to the main highway, and 2 guards at the gate Paba, the gate that led to the suburbs. 24 guards in total around this temple. David's setting all this up. He never gets to see the temple, does he? That was built in Solomon's day. But David's vision was to have doors everywhere. Everyone is invited to Yahweh's house. But the conditions for entry have not changed. These Levites were posted to make sure God's holiness was honored. They appear to have been on a rotation basis every 7 days. You get that from chapter 9 of 1 Chronicles and verse 25. We'll be coming to that a bit later. But it's hard work, brothers and sisters. Standing there, focused and alert all day, sun, rain, whatever the weather. You had to stay focused, but you had to remember this is extremely important work. You never were allowed to let your guard down for a moment. And the reason you were willing to do this was because you loved the temple. You loved Yahweh. You loved His holiness. That's why you wanted to protect it. Do you have a love for Yahweh's house, brothers and sisters, that would enable you to be relied on to stand guard as a doorkeeper? Particularly in this age, in the Western world, when there is just so much more exciting things to do than to tediously stand watching over the things of Yahweh? Well, let's take a lesson, brothers and sisters, out of the life of one of those sons of Korah as recorded in Psalm 84. Come over to Psalm 84. It's written around this time, most likely, or possibly in the times of Solomon. And we know that it's a favourite psalm of many. It's written by one of the sons of Korah. We don't know his name, but that's not important, you see. What we want to see in this psalm, brothers and sisters, his love for God's house is what's seen as important. It's not an academic sense that he's standing guard. It's not a ritualistic sense. It's because he knows that's where Yahweh can be found. He knows that's where Yahweh's character can be seen. And in this psalm, that makes him happy. In fact, the theme of this psalm is about being happy in regards to Yahweh's house. So Psalm 84 could be divided into 3 sections, all centered around this idea of the word happy or blessed. Verse 1 to 4, happy are those who dwell in Yahweh's house. In verse 5 to 8, happy are those who journey to Yahweh's house. Verse 9 to 12, happy are those who build their life on Yahweh. The strong longing and desire of this son of Korah to be in and around or on the way to Yahweh's house is evident all the way through this psalm. Have a look at verse 1. How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Yahweh of hosts. This word amiable, it means a serious longing for, an aching, a burning desire to be in Yahweh's house. In verse 2, my soul longeth, yea, even fainteth for the courts of Yahweh. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. In verse 3, he's jealous of all the birds, the swallows, the sparrows that have their home made in Yahweh's house. And he wants to be able to be like one of those sparrows and just stay there all year round and be permanently in God's house. Verse 5, blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, in whose heart are the ways of them. In the heart of these traveling towards Zion, brothers and sisters, verse 5 is talking about the desire of those who are on the way to Zion. You'll see in verse 7, they go from strength to strength, every one of them in Zion. So the them of verse 5, which is in italics, it's really linking you to them that are in Zion. That's the destination. So on the journey, all they are thinking about are the different ways to get to the tabernacle. They think about all the paths that lead to God's house. That's what's constantly on their mind. So they not only love God's house, they actually love every pathway to God's house. Verse 6, it says, who passing through the valley of Baca make it a well. The rain also filleth the pools. The word Baca, the idea of this valley here is the valley of tears, the valley of weeping. It's a dry, parched valley. This is the difficult part of the journey. And on the way to Jerusalem, on the way to this temple, there are tough parts to negotiate. You feel weary, you feel dreary when you're going through this section. But to anybody going to God's house, even the most dreary part of the journey is turned into a well of life. These travelers make even the gloomiest places on the journey a place of happiness because they know where it's leading to. So they willingly go through these tough parts. Verse 7 talks about going from strength to strength. Now, on a journey, many of you traveled quite a distance to get here. You might have had children, and on the way, all you hear is, are we nearly there yet? And there's dreariness and there's tiredness. Can we turn in to the gas station to fill up and stay there for a couple of hours? Because the journey's quite long and tedious. Well, these ones get stronger and stronger the closer they get. These travelers going to God's house get more and more energy the closer they come to God's house. They become full of increasing eagerness and excitement. But maybe you did have that on the way here because you know it's Bible school and you can only come here once a year and you're excited. You've only got 2 hours to go, only 1 hour to go, and you're here. Well, that's what this son of Korah was feeling like when journeying to the tabernacle. And then we come to verse 10, and this is probably the verse that you know so well. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. Now, there's two ways of reading that, but I think they actually both have the same meaning. It may be that the idea is one day in God's house is 1,000 times better than a day anywhere else. That's true, isn't it? Or it could be that one day in God's house is better than 1,000 days spent anywhere else. It doesn't matter. The point is being made. One day was more than enough than 1,000 days somewhere else. There was no comparison. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Just to be on the edge of God's house, like just on the door threshold, was far more pleasurable to this son of Korah, far more enjoyable and rewarding than having the best possible position inside the temporary tents of wickedness. And of course, Korah had set up a temporary tent, and he invited his children right into the heart and sanctuary of that tent. And they said, no, just to be on the very edge of God's house is a better place to be than inside the sanctum of your tent of wickedness, because that tent will ultimately fail. Pretty important job, isn't it? Porters and gatekeepers. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Every time you enter your ecclesial hall and you shake the doorkeeper's hand, think of the Levites acting as porters. It's a very important role. We should not dismiss it. So time passes on, and we come to perhaps the lowest point in the whole line of David, where the kingdom was hanging by a thread. God's promises to David were being tested to the hilt. Their fulfillment had come down to the wire. For all their good work, the Levites lost the support of their king. There they were, faithfully endeavoring to keep the unclean out of Yahweh's house. And there he was, bringing in the most unclean, abominable woman right into the heart of the kingdom by marrying her to his son. If you're wondering who I'm talking about, the king's name is Jehoshaphat, and the woman he brought into his family was Athaliah, the daughter of Jezebel. And for all Jehoshaphat's good points, brothers and sisters, and he had many, his one weakness was being a very poor gatekeeper, a very poor porter. And the worst thing he did was to open his door to the kingdom, open his door to his kingdom, to the daughter of Jezebel. And he let in Athaliah. And she came in, and like Korah of old, she was defiant and arrogant. But more than that, she was brutal. She wiped out the whole of the royal seed. 70 children were killed by her. But one little boy was hidden away, Joash by name, and the whole of the promises to David hang by a thread. Quite literally, it had come down to the wire. So for 6 years, Athaliah had a way, didn't she? She's the sole female monarch to have the kingdom as the sole monarchy by a woman. Very low point in Israel's history. But when the time came, the faithful Jehoiada thought it was the right time to reveal the boy king and to secure the throne for him and to depose Athaliah. When that time came, who did he rely on? Well, he had two sources, brothers and sisters. There are two records concerning this account. One's in the King's record, 2 Kings chapter 11, and there's one in the Chronicles record. In the 2 Kings record, we find that Jehoiada relied on the royal bodyguard. In 2 Kings 11 verse 4, we won't turn back there, it says, the rulers over hundreds with the captains and the guard. The captains and the guard. Now the captains were the royal bodyguards. They were from the army. So the captains and the guard. Who were the guard, brothers and sisters? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that in 2 Chronicles 23, we get told that that guard was the Levitical temple guard. Now, so come to 2 Chronicles 23, and we find more details about how this Levitical guard helped the army, the bodyguards, the royal bodyguards of the king, combine together to bring about a resolution to this horrible problem. 2 Kings 23. So we read in verse 2, these captains of hundreds in verse 1. In verse 2, they went about in Judah and gathered the Levites out of all the cities of Judah and the chief of the fathers of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. So there's a combination of the royal bodyguard and the Levites on this occasion. And in verse 4, it says that he divided the Levites into 3 groups. In King's record, it says he divided the royal guards into 3 groups. So it's the same 3 groups, but in these 3 groups, there's a combination of the royal bodyguards and the Levitical guards, the porters, and the gatekeepers. Have a look at verse 4. This is the thing that ye shall do. A third part of you entering on the Sabbath of the priests and of the Levites shall be porters of the doors. There's our role. Porters and gatekeepers. And in verse 5, they were to be the gatekeepers at the king's house and the foundation gate. And in verse 6, the instructions were made. Let none come in but the ones who normally were allowed. This is a really elaborate plan, brothers and sisters. Make it look like nothing's out of the ordinary. And so in verse 7, The Levites surround the king, you'll remember. Weapons at the ready. Did the Levites ever need to use a sword? Well, they did on this occasion. This is heart and mouth stuff, isn't it? This is adrenaline pumping. This is what it took to be a reliable porter. And in verse 15, of course, we know that Athaliah is killed by the sword outside God's house, and Yahweh's house was protected. And in verse 19, it says that he instructs the porters to mind the gates and keep anything unclean from ever entering again. Keep God's temple morally clean was the instruction given to the Levites. There's some pretty powerful lessons in this, brothers and sisters, for us today, isn't there? What are you doing to help keep God's temple clean here in 2025? This is exactly the same message that Paul says to the Corinthian ecclesia in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And he tells them that you are the temple of the living God. It's not necessarily a literal building. It was back then in the days of Athaliah and Jehoiada. But that's a parable. You are the temple of the living God, he says. And he spells it out quite plainly. He says, believers belong here and unbelievers stay over there. Righteousness is here. You've got to protect that from unrighteousness over there. The light of the truth is with you. Keep it separate from the darkness that's over there. Christ should be your hero. He is your hero. You need to shield him from all the world's heroes, the Belials out there, the distasteful, immoral characters and characteristics that they display. The temple of God is you. It's here. Don't compromise. Don't negotiate with it. Don't negotiate with the idols of this world. Verse 17 of 2 Corinthians 6, don't let the unclean things of this filthy world come anywhere near you, or anywhere near your children, or anywhere near your ecclesia, he says. You owe it to yourself. You owe it to them to take up the challenge to be a doorkeeper who is not afraid to stand tall when it matters, to protect God's holiness in these last days. We don't have long to go, do we, brothers and sisters? We don't believe we do. Well, they went into captivity for 70 years, at the end of which some 42,000 or so returned. So let's come back to 1 Chronicles and chapter 9 and pick up the story in 1 Chronicles 9. Now, this is just a suggestion. You might have something different on this, but I'm going to suggest that Chronicles was written by Ezra. I think there's enough information to suggest that. And the one objective that Ezra is writing Chronicles is to inspire Levites to return and help with the new temple. So there's a main focus on Levite work all through Chronicles. We saw that in 2 Chronicles 23 with the emphasis on the Levitical guard, whereas Kings talked about the royal bodyguard. Chronicles didn't mention the royal bodyguard. The focus is on Levites. So come to chapter 9 of 1 Chronicles. Now, chapter 9 clearly is written after the return, because it's about the return from Babylon in verse 1. So all Israel were reckoned by genealogies, and behold, they were written in a book of the kings of Israel and Judah, who were carried away to Babylon for their transgressions. And this is going to record their coming back. So somebody must have known the details of this coming back, which is why we suggest it's probably Ezra. And it can be divided like this. In verse 3 to 9, we get a very small reference to all the children of Israel who came back. It passes over that very quickly. But then in verse 10 to 13, it starts to narrow down, and now he references the priests who came back. 4 verses. But the bulk of the chapter, from verse 14 to 34, is about the Levites who came back. Just notice, brothers and sisters, that of all that returned, the greatest attention is dedicated to the Levites. But then notice that out of the Levites, verse 17 to 29, we have the porters. Verse 30 to 32, we have other work. And then verse 33, one verse about the singers. So out of all the Levites that came back, take notice that the greatest attention is given to the porters. So the whole of the return from Babylon in chapter 9 zeroes in on the porters. Have you seen that before? This is what Ezra is concerned about. This is how important their role is. So let's go into a bit of verse 17 down to verse 29. So verse 17 to 18, we get the names of the porters. Verse 19 to 21, we get the history of the porters. Verse 22, we get the qualities of the porters. Verse 23 to 29, we get the work of the porters. All about porters, you see. They're so important to this story that Ezra is writing about. He's trying to inspire Levites to come back to be porters. He's got an important role for them. There's a new temple to be built. God's holiness needs to be protected once again. And in verse 22, we find out that he found 212 porters in total. 212. And it says this in verse 22, all these which were chosen to be porters in the gates were 212. These were reckoned by their genealogy and their villages, whom David and Samuel the seer did ordain in their set office. So this word did ordain means to appoint, to establish. And this word set office literally means to be dependable, to be trustworthy, to be faithful. Some other translations put it like this, and I think this succinctly tells us why they are so needed. The gatekeepers had been assigned to their positions of trust by David and Samuel the seer. That's the NIV. The ESV says that David and Samuel the seer established them in their office of trust. So can you see that these are appointed because they're dependable, they're reliable? Now, when we read about David and the 24 courses of porters he set up, it was actually a work already started by Samuel, wasn't it? He's the first one that we know about opening the doors. He knew all about being a doorkeeper in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 15. And Samuel was instrumental in restoring credibility back into temple worship. After all of that debauched mess of Eli's sons, that corrupt system that was happening at the door of the tabernacle, no one was protecting God's holiness at that time. And Hannah prayed to God that someone would come along who could be a porter. And along comes Samuel. And he trains men in the schools of the prophets and such like. Men from his own tribe very often. He inspired them. And he got many going. And David comes along sometime later. And he finds no reason to change these men. They were still reliable. They were still men who could be trusted with the most precious of items. And now years have passed, and they've gone into captivity, and they're coming back, and they're still dependable. They're still absolutely reliable. I would suggest colouring that verse in, brothers and sisters. If you want to be a spiritual Levite now and in the future, you need to be dependable. And I can tell you right now, and I'm sure you know it, that many in the brotherhood are dropping like flies, especially when it comes to things like theistic evolution, or head coverings for sisters, or sisters speaking, or gay lifestyles, or transgender issues. Can your ecclesia depend on you to help keep those things out? This is the role of a gatekeeper. Jude talks about this role. In Jude, he says, to contend earnestly for the faith. And we know that means to fight. That idea means to fight hard, to agonize. Because there are some that have crept in. They've come in the doors. Some have come in the front door, some have come in the back door. And they'd taken over in the days of Jude. So have a look at verse 23. So they and their children had the oversight of the gates of the house of Yahweh, namely the house of the tabernacle by wards. So they had oversight of the gates. That was their responsibility. And then it says in verse 26, for these Levites, the 4 chief porters were in their set office. There it is again. The word means to be faithful or trustworthy. And were over the chambers and treasuries of the house of God. They looked after the treasure house. Remember that house of Asuppum? It's still there. It needs to be protected. So what's the best way to protect God's house? Well, verse 27, they lodged round about the house. They slept there. They stayed there. Because the charge was upon them, and the opening thereof every morning pertained to them. Those 4 chief porters never left. They were always on the job. They had help from the other 212 during the daytime, but they stayed there all night. The opening thereof every morning. So, just like Samuel, they kept God's house vibrant and active. Every morning, the doors were opened by them. And it says in verse 28, and certain of them had the charge of the ministering of vessels, that they should bring them in and out by tale. The word tale is an idea of a record. So you had to have a record of everything that went in and everything that went out. They knew exactly how much they had and where it was stored. They were not casual. They were not careless. This was God's house, remember. Ecclesial life is never to be casual, is it? It's never to be just as you please. It has to be meticulously organized. And these Levites are doing that. And then in verse 29 and 30, there are some words here that we've seen before. Some of them also were appointed to oversee the vessels and all the instruments of the sanctuary, and the fine flour, and the wine, and the oil, and the frankincense, and the spices. And some of the sons of the priests made the ointment of the spices. Do you remember this from earlier, yesterday, brothers and sisters? We saw this in Numbers 14, didn't we? And Numbers 4, I should say. The fine flour and wine, that's filling one's hands. That's the meal offering. The oil, that's the reading of God's word. The frankincense, that's prayer. The spices, the ointments for anointing, that was to help others in the role of prophet, priest, or king. They're still doing the same things that Eleazar set up way back in Numbers 4. Things haven't changed. They are dependable. Are they the 4 things that are the mainstay of your life, brothers and sisters? Is your life one of consistency and example to others? This is the lessons, isn't it? It's pretty powerful stuff. But if we had to choose a standout example of all porters and gatekeepers from the annals of history, there's one man that stands taller than all the others. Such was the example of this man that he became the mentor and inspiration for all who followed him. Like yesterday, we saw John Mark as an example of someone that was a soldier who deserted but then became a good recorder. Well, here, an example of a faithful porter is mentioned back in verse 19 and verse 20. This section is the history, isn't it? We said this is the history of the porters. And in relating their history, Ezra mentions something that we don't know from reading Numbers. Because at some point, we find here, probably after Korah's rebellion in Numbers 16, the sons of Korah took on the role of being keepers of the gates of the tabernacles and keepers of the entry. Have a look at verse 19. And Shalom the son of Korah, the son of Ebiasaph, the son of Korah and his brethren of the house of his father, the Korahites, were over the work of the service, keepers of the gates of the tabernacle, and their fathers, being over the hosts of Yahweh, were keepers of the entry. They took this role on. We don't read about it, but here we're told that they did this. And they did it willingly. They said, we don't want someone like our father ever coming into Yahweh's presence again, so leave that job to us. We'll watch the doors. And it was, by and large, the sons of Korah who continued to do it right through the generations. It's incredible. So just note this. Verse 19 has its history rooted in Numbers 16, right at the beginning of the wilderness wanderings. But in verse 20, it says, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was ruler over them in times past, and Yahweh was with him. This, I'm going to suggest, is rooted in Numbers 25, which is at the end of the wilderness wanderings. And it tells us that Phinehas was ruler over them in times past. And this word ruler means a commander. It's like a military leader, someone out the front. The Hebrew word nagad. Well, when did he become a commander? Well, I know that the suggestion often goes that when the children of Korah stood apart from their dad, that Phinehas took them under his wing and brought them up. But if you have a look at the ages of the sons of Korah versus the age Phinehas was, that makes it impossible. You see, Korah was about the same age as Moses. He was about 80 coming out of Egypt. So that made his sons about 50 to 60 years old. Phinehas, on the other hand, was the grandson of Aaron. And Aaron was about the same age as Moses and Korah, 83 years old. So the grandson of Phinehas would make Phinehas about 20 years old. So the idea that a 20-year-old took 40-year-olds under his wing and brought them up is a fallacy. It doesn't happen like that. So the way in which it took place is that there was an event in Phinehas' life which cemented forever the relationship that existed between Phinehas and the sons of Korah. And it took place right in front of the door of the tabernacle. Come to Numbers 25, brothers and sisters. It's an astonishing record. And after this event, the sons of Korah looked at Phinehas and said, he's going to be our mentor. Every child that's born in the sons of Korah's line are going to be taught about Phinehas because he exemplifies what it means to be a doorkeeper. You want to be a doorkeeper, son? Let me tell you about Phinehas. So in verse 6 of Numbers 25, we read about a prince of Israel, a prince of Simeon, with this Midianitish floozy on his arms, walking straight past Moses and Aaron to the door of the tabernacle, the center of the camp. And this horrifies Phinehas. He's thinking of Yahweh's holy character. He can't stand what's happening. And he picks up a javelin. And without compromise, he stops that man and woman stone cold in their act of immorality. And it says in verse 8, so the plague was stayed. There it is. He's doing the role that Numbers said you should as a Levite. To stay the plague. Gatekeepers could stop plagues, you see. And so 24,000 died in verse 9, but thanks to Phinehas, it could have been much, much more. Maybe even as much as 50,000, like the time they looked in the ark. But who was it that he killed, brothers and sisters? Oh, have a look at verse 14. Now the name of the Israelite that was slain, even that was slain with the Midianitish women, was Zimri, the son of Salu, a prince of the chief house among the Simeonites. Isn't that astonishing? We've come a full circle. Do you remember on Monday, we started in Genesis 34, and we saw Simeon and Levi as two brothers that were thick as thieves. They were as close as two brothers could be. And here we have Phinehas from the tribe of Levi putting a spear through the prince of Simeon. And for this action, God gives Phinehas a blessing, brothers and sisters. In verse 12, we're told that his life as a soldier would ultimately result in everlasting peace. He'd be allowed to retire from the army. The battle would be over. And from him, there would be an everlasting priesthood promised to him. Now, we know it's after the order of Melchizedek, but it was going to consist, that order of Melchizedek would consist of priests who act just like Phinehas the gatekeeper. So what have we learnt this morning, brothers and sisters? To be a gatekeeper is to protect God's holiness. It required men of strength in character and resolve to, and of trust, to be reliable and dependable. We should all ache to be in Yahweh's house and love to be associated with it. As part of the temple of God ourselves, we need to keep things that are unclean out of our families, out of our ecclesias, and out of our own lives, no matter how much the agony and the struggle it might cause. So what have we learnt today that might be able to be seen in Malachi chapter 3? Well, Malachi 3 says that a book of remembrance was written before them for those that thought upon his name. Now, Yahweh is the great chronicler who controls what entries are to be put in and what are to be left out, like those guardhouse gatekeepers, recording what goes in and what comes out. That's Yahweh's role. He is a gatekeeper to the book of life. In that day when I make up my jewels, brothers and sisters, the promise is there that one day we will be part of Yahweh's treasure and be placed in his treasure house.